Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and the last time we checked in on my twin European nightcrawler bins, they were still resting up here on top of this frame for the VermiBag Mini. I've since reorganized stuff and cleaned some stuff up, and everything has shifted over, so the bins that we're checking in on are over here now. And last time we checked in, past couple times we checked in, we were always faced with a little bit of a surprise. I don't want to call it an issue because it turned out to be a non-issue, but it was this crazy growth. You can even see signs of the growth still on the walls of the container. Both containers were affected by this. And the past two visits were focused heavily on, I guess in the first check-in we were panicking because we didn't know what it was, so it was all about getting the stuff out. And then based on the feedback from that first encounters video, everyone was saying it's slime mold, dog vomit mold, I think is the name some people referred to it as. And it was determined that this stuff is fine. It's safe for the worms. So the second go around last time, we actually held on to this stuff after scraping it off the second bin's wall, and then we actually shared it between the two bins and we fed the worms with this stuff. So today I don't see any more of that growth, so no more surprises. And even if it wasn't here, I guess the surprise aspect would not be surprise over concern. It would be surprise, you know, just out of it being a windfall, a benefit for the bin, because it's good stuff and the worms like it. But today I think we're just back to a routine feeding. I bought down some food for them. I'm going to slip on a glove and we're going to get to work. Like I do sometimes, I put together some info about these systems. You can see that the systems don't have an equal worm count. Usually when I've got twin systems like this, you know, I just come up with a single number to account for both bins populations, but we did have the cocoon nursery from the system that all these worms came from which, after the cocoons hatched, we did a haul out of babies, and we ended up plopping those babies into bin number 2, which gives bin number 2 a slightly larger population. This is bin number 1 right here. Last fed 10 days ago. Let's get these plastic coverings off and see how things look. Kind of hoping that today is just a routine feeding, because even though the outcome of the last couple encounters with the mold ended up being a non-issue, like I said earlier, it's still just, you know, a little extra churn to have to process something that's a little bit foreign and potentially, you know, or at least not potentially, but seemingly having the potential to be harmful. So just an abundant amount of caution seemed to be the right way to play it. I don't know, between those top covering pieces of newspaper as well as this feeding zone indicator just showing us where we last fed, it's just a coffee filter. It does seem like both of those are pretty heavily worn. I do have some fresh coffee filters in here along with these potato peels that are going to be fed to the worms today. So we can replace the feeding zone indicator coffee filter that we just removed with a brand new one. And I could fish out a new piece of newspaper we could use as top covering here too. So maybe we'll just utilize all those old top covering pieces of paper as bedding underneath the feeding and upgrade them to some new top covering materials. When we ended last time, we scattered these nice leaves across the top, give the worms a nice natural environment to play around in on top here, with the plastic coverings creating that recirculation of the moisture that's held within the system. This top layer of stuff gets a nice constant moisture level, which doesn't really diminish. In fact, I would think it just gradually soaks into everything. And all right, let's get this little guy off the wall. I guess we just bugged out that little guy enough that he wanted to climb out. But yeah, I like the way the plastic hangs onto the moisture in the system, prevents it from evaporating, allowing things to dry out and become hazardous for the worms. But I'll also try to remain attentive as to the moisture within the system to see if it's possible that we might be overdoing it with the plastic coverings. So at some point I'll typically want to kind of wean myself off of the really superb, excellent moisture retention capability of the plastic, and then switch over to something that provides a little bit more airflow and a little bit less restrictive. I don't know, the ability for some people refer to off-gassing or something like that. I guess I'm not sure of the right expression, but basically sometimes if materials are in the breakdown process down within your worm bins, sometimes you got to give the bin a chance to air out and let those gases that are developing in the decomposing materials out of the bin instead of potentially remaining down within the material and causing harm to the system's occupants. So this last feeding they got was a whole bunch of unusual stuff, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect. And it's weird, wow, okay, interesting. Something I normally don't get in my bins, but I just caught a whiff of ammonia, which, as you might be able to guess, is not a good thing. So I mean, it sounds stupid for me to be chuckling at the end of a statement like that, but I'm going to see if I could try to put it into perspective and figure out what to make of it. So the ammonia, you know, I wonder if maybe no plastic coverings could have been the simple solution to preventing that from happening. I could be wrong. It could have just been the combination of materials with which I fed. It was weird stuff, you know. I took some pasta, and some of the pasta wasn't even straight, you know, wheat or flour noodles. Some of it was actually black bean noodles, so there was really no gluten or no flour in some of the stuff they got. I don't know, it was just weird material. Black bean spaghetti and just some shell noodles. The shell noodles were plain old flour. So I don't want to panic, you know. I want to assume that little, I smell it again now. Whew, okay. I'm hoping that maybe just by kind of loosening all the material that was down in the feeding area, we can sort of at least let the gases of the ammonia leave the system. And I guess that probably explains why we're not seeing a whole lot of worms down the middle either. I would think that ammonia, you know, considering how harsh of a cleaning chemical it is, I would think it's not the sort of stuff that you want to encounter if you're a worm. If there's any sense of that being nearby, you probably head the other direction. So I was kind of hoping for kind of a boring routine feeding here, to tell you the truth. But I feel like I need to keep this system on watch. I can't think of anything offhand to do to really prevent or address what I'm observing here, which makes me a little nervous too. But I'm hoping that just the restoration of a fairly straightforward, almost boring feeding for these little guys might be enough to get the system on the road to recovery. There's weird stuff going on now. Something I didn't mention earlier, as I was plowing through the feeding area, I got distracted by the ammonia scent. It did seem to me like the contents of the feeding area were a little bit dry. It kind of makes sense because it was just noodles thrown in here, which in themselves, other than being a little bit damp from having sat in the water overnight before being fed to soften them up, they didn't really have any moisture content to them. So kind of, and not only that, but we did also introduce that mold. And the mold might have caused the dryness that you might have observed as I was picking through here. There was a very obvious lack of moisture down here in the feeding zone. So I feel like I'm hoping that when we cover up here and we check the outer edges that things are looking better, and that's where I'm guessing the worms are going to be. But I really don't know what else to do here other than just kind of stick to the original idea of trying to make this very routine, and then hopefully by giving them a fairly straightforward, semi-boring feeding zone this time without any sort of experimental, you know, noodles or without any mold or anything like that, maybe we can start watching things in here turn around and get better. So I just threw in a little bit of my prepared bedding as well as a handful of dry leaves. I think that should be a pretty nice foundation for half of these potato peels that I'm going to feed them today. So let's see, I did have one whole potato in here that I cut in half, so we'll make sure that this system gets its fair share on that. And then in can come the potato peels themselves. Blends right in with the leaves. Can't even hardly tell how much I just added. I want to be fair, but I think the second system is predicted to have a couple hundred more worms in it, so we'll save the rest for the other system. I think it's an even, fair split here. Leftovers. Leftover bits of corn that we stumbled on, but it's about the only leftovers I remember seeing. There were other smaller bits of corn floating around in here too that I didn't really set aside. And I've also got coffee, so I'm going to do away with some coffee to go hand in hand with this potato peel. I've also got my grit. The grit that I use here is pulverized eggshell, just to help the worms break down the foods that they're eating. And before we go overboard adding more and more bedding, I'm just thinking we could take some of this top covering leafy material that we scraped aside in the beginning and put it down into the feeding area where it's going to get a whole lot more attention. It's probably just on the brink of starting to break down anyway, since it's been sitting down here in the bin for the past 10 days as top covering. So I'm assuming that the worms are going to really enjoy that as they're bedding to surround their food. And I just feel like I want to go really simple, and to me this seems like about as simple as you can get as far as feedings are concerned. Some kitchen scraps, some fresh bedding, a little bit of grit. Moisture wise, I think we're, even though we might have observed a little bit of lack of moisture down the middle when we first excavated the feeding area, I'm assuming we're still okay as far as moisture in general throughout the bin, so I'm not going to react. But I almost forgot, we also wanted to include some of this torn up paper as bedding in the feeding area too. So this is a nice generous application of bedding in here. I'm just going to kind of nudge it in here alongside the feeding area. And I think they're going to appreciate that. Nice big chunk of paper for them to nibble on. I might have to step away for a moment to go find myself a nice piece of paper that we can cover up with to replace the previous top covering. But we can also grab one of these used coffee filters to become our new feeding zone indicator. But you know what? Before we get into covering things up here, I was still curious to see how the outer edges of this system are holding up, since the middle didn't seem very promising. And I'm not worrying yet, so I'm still remaining optimistic that the ammonia scent was just a passing thing with that last unusual feeding. So anytime I find stuff like this, which I believe is just chunks of pasta maybe still trying to break up or break down, break up, break down. Figure if I could break it up into little small fragments, then it should help speed the process. After 10 days of being in here and not being able to break down, any help, I'm assuming, would be a good thing. So let's get this little worm off the wall. Maybe it's the same one that was deciding to climb again. Before we close up here, let's just examine the outer edges of the system. Man, are these castings nice. They certainly are crumbly and flowing. There's no... Oof. I think I just caught another whiff of the ammonia, but it might have just been some leftover from before. It didn't seem as harsh as before. Something I really don't like smelling, and I'm hoping we don't encounter the same thing in the other bin. But since these are sort of match set systems being managed in very similar ways, I suppose the potential exists for us encountering something similar in the other system. I'm going to go find a nice replacement top covering for these little guys. We'll level things off, get these guys covered up, and move on to bin number 2. Now this moisture that I'm coming in here with, it's not because of the, observation of some dry materials. This is the spray that I've got, which has the BTI mosquito dunks solution in it. And it's because what is going on here? Okay. It's because I did start observing some of my newer systems having a little bit of a flying insect issue developing. I thought it might be time to reinstate the introduction of BTI bacteria into my worm bins, and I don't think it's something that is required to be applied in great amounts, because it is a bacteria. You would assume it would just start spreading within the system on its own. So I figured the little squirt of that stuff couldn't hurt. Other than that, the moisture in here does seem quite nice. Even though the material is very flaky and flowing, it does seem like it's got good moisture content throughout. So I don't want to send things out of balance here. I'm also assuming that the frozen potato that we just threw in there, as it thaws, will also emit a little bit of moisture. So things look good. Let's top off with some more of these nice fresh leaves that they got last time. Just like a nice thin covering of natural materials. Except this is not natural materials. This is stuff that my leaf vac pulled up when I was collecting leaves, and once in a while I do pick up a little scrap of, I guess that's like weed barrier material. I'm not sure if all of it is that, but I know that that stuff isn't going to get broken down in a worm bin, so out it comes. Alright, looks good. I really hope the second system doesn't have any ammonia smells or in it. I'm a little bit getting ready for these systems to just get back to being boring and ho-hum. I don't need excitement like this. It's so funny. Every time I don't know if it was visible, every time I come into one of my systems and I could see the address, I'm like, oh great, now I gotta do some extra video editing to get rid of the presence of my home address out there for the world to see. Not that I would mind having all of you come visit me in person and check out my worms, but I don't think I can really handle making this into a tourist trap for worm aficionados. Alright, on to bin number 2. Okay, keeping my fingers crossed, Please don't let there be ammonia smells in here. I really don't feel like having to worry about these little guys too, so let's get things uncovered here. When I'm dealing with more than one system that's being managed similarly, like in the case of these two systems, a lot of times I'll sort of fumble through the first bin, but then I'll try to use the information that I gathered while working on the first system to help speed the process of getting the second system completed more efficiently. So we'll see if I can make that happen here today. That newspaper is in much better shape. That was a new one that was added, I believe, last time we were in here. And then, since we didn't have any coffee filters to use as a feeding zone indicator, this piece of newspaper came in to serve that purpose. But this will just become bedding when we rebuild the feeding area, and we'll use a nice new coffee filter as feeding zone indicator. And then that piece of newspaper covering the top will just go right back into service since it's still in very good shape. I'm kind of making a beeline right for the feeding area to see if, number one, if it's going to exhibit the dryness like we saw on the other one. Maybe presence of that mold still being in here, sort of utilizing the moisture. Here I'm not seeing it, which is nice, good. As a result, there's more worms hanging out down here amongst the food and stuff. So I think, I wonder, could it have been because of the mold leaving behind the ammonia? I'm not that familiar with what the byproduct of mold breaking stuff down is. And I'm assuming we're going to bump into a few more larger chunks of corn as we make our way through. Anyway. And one little novelty item that's a throwback to the system that all these worms in both of these bins came from originally. They all came from a single bin in which we were doing this really cool pocket feeding, alternating the feeding location on each turn. Every time we would check in, we would shift to the next corner. That was such an interesting setup. And we kept really detailed notes, so we always knew exactly what we were looking at and exactly how long it had been in the bin, so we can gauge its breakdown progress against the amount of time it's had to break down. So that was all kind of interesting. Probably one of the more interesting, video series that I've had in recent times. Wow, I wonder what the heck they're so jazzed about down here. And guess what? Oddly enough, right where all the worms are, right here in the material that I just upturned, I'm catching a little whiff of ammonia again. Certainly not as strong as I had observed previously in the other system, which is a relief. And it's not too much of a surprise, I got to admit, because, you know, systems being managed similar to one another should exhibit signs and, you know, symptoms, whatever you want to call it, similar to the other system. But I would say the main differences here is that less ammonia smell. Treat that as a good thing. But now another unusual, somewhat foul odor. I do feel like I should just chalk most of this up to using somewhat foreign materials with all those noodles, and even those noodles that are made of non-wheat material. All of those were kind of unusual things, not to mention all the mold that was left in these systems from the last go around. All right, a little bit more ammonia smell. I don't know. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of good advice from the viewers who've had more experience than me with the ammonia smell, because I'm pretty sure this ain't the first time I'm noticing it. But it certainly doesn't happen frequently for me. That's what's kind of getting me into that weird feeling like I'm not sure I know what to do. So here again, I think we're just going to go back to what we know and, you know, return to trying to set this feeding area up in as routine and straightforward a way as possible. And then we'll have a chance to explore the other edges of the bin on the outsides. Hopefully things will continue to, you know, bear similarities to what we observed in bin number 1. Let's get this feeding in here, because I am curious to see how things on the outer edges look. Trying to remember how we did this. We combined a couple different types of bedding materials, I believe, beneath the food. And the prepared shredded paper mix is very, very damp. This batch of material is quite damp compared to how I usually prepare this stuff. So even though the leaves are going in dry, I think it's a pretty good complement to each other. Between the damp paper bedding underneath with the dry leaves on top, and then this frozen stuff that's going to thaw and emit moisture, I think that takes care of any concerns there might be about these dry leaves sucking up moisture from the neighboring materials. Once again, we're going to add grit, add coffee, and then we could take all this stuff that we collected off the top surface and, oh, let's not forget the leftovers too. Get the leftover corn bits. It seems like this system's got a lot more corn in it. I don't know why. And our novelty item. So cool. It's incredible. This stem of the pumpkin, it was so big. Watching it gradually break down over time is amazing. All right. I think that's all the leftover foods we found. There's another chunk of corn. But before we can cover everything up neatly here, let's bring in all this collected top covering stuff, including the feeding zone indicator, which we'll place in here too. All right. I really hope things start to become routine and boring in here soon, because if every time we check on a bin, it's always got some sort of a little surprise lurking around the corner for us. I don't know. Some people might see that as exciting. To me, The only excitement I need is seeing a whole bunch of worms squirming around looking happy. Anything else that makes me think that they might be distressed or having issues doesn't lend itself to fun. That ends up just generating undue worry. So this side looked pretty good. It was almost the same, right? A little bit more crumbly and loose than perhaps it needs to be, but that's fine. As long as there's worms in it, that doesn't tell me it's dry just because it's loose and crumbly. Worm castings can be that way. Even if they've got nice high moisture content, it's remarkable how they're able to flow. And then a quick look-see on what's over on this side, and then we should be able to level things off. Maybe we can do another quick little worm spotting just in case we don't see any more, and I don't think after this we'll see any more, because after this it's covering up and putting away. So let's let these little wormies squirm down. I'm glad to see that things on the outer edges look good and I don't smell any more ammonia. So I think we're safe, and I think we're more or less done here. Let's let these little guys settle down. Alright, I think we're almost done. We're just going to do the same in this system as we did before, is just kind of reintroduce this BTI before we cover up, because I don't want to have a resurgence of flying insects in my wormery. After introducing the BTI and running it in my systems for a couple months, it did seem like it had completely eliminated all signs of flying insects in my systems. So I've got a pretty high degree of trust in the material, in the BTI's capability. So now that I'm starting to see little flying insects beginning to move in, since I did bring a halt to the use of this stuff after it seemed like the problem it was trying to address was solved. I didn't even have any, and I kind of let it all run out, but I did whip up another batch. So as needed, we'll apply it, and maybe even as a preventative measure, we'll just start at least introducing a little bit of it into every system every time, just to make sure, you know, there's sufficient amounts of that stuff floating around in each system to be effective and continue to keep the little flying insects away from our wormies. Okay, my feeding zone indicator, you know what, let's give the same treatment as we did to the other one. This nice top coating of fresh natural materials. I'm very curious to see what things are gonna look like in here next time we check in. It almost makes me feel like maybe we wouldn't want to wait another 10 days before we check in. Although nothing we've seen seemed to be earth-shattering or detrimental to the system, so maybe I'm overreacting. I really shouldn't overreact. I think things will be just fine in here, and I guess we'll only know for sure next time we pop back. So hopefully you'll be with me next time we come back in here to see how these Euros are coming along. But for now, we're done. All I've got left to do here is get stuff covered up and put away, as well as get stuff cleaned up, such as my glove and the table. But that's all really boring, and I'm not going to keep you around for that. Before I go though, really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.